Let me share a story I wish I didn't have to tell. It revolves around my wife, Laura, and the unraveling of our relationship. I can't pinpoint exactly when it all started to go wrong, but I do remember a time when we felt unshakable. Like any marriage, we had our ups and downs, but nothing that screamed, "Beware!" Laura had always been someone who loved to help others, frequently volunteering at shelters or organizing local drives for the less fortunate. Initially, I admired this about her. She had such a big heart, always striving to improve the world around her. At first, it didn't seem odd to me, or at least I didn't think so. She'd spend a few evenings each month at the shelter, and I thought, no big deal, right? It was a regular thing. She would always come home at a reasonable hour. We'd share dinner, maybe enjoy a glass of wine together, and everything felt normal. I never questioned it. She was doing meaningful work, and it gave her a passion outside of our life together. But then the dynamics began to shift. It didn't happen overnight. It was more of a slow, sneaky descent. Initially, she started making more frequent trips to the shelter, staying out late with excuses about emergencies or some crisis involving a regular who needed urgent help. Soon, it escalated beyond just evenings. Weekends became part of the mix, and eventually, I'd get texts from her saying she wouldn't be coming home at all, needing to stay overnight to handle a situation. And me, I trusted her. I really did. Or perhaps I just wanted to believe she was genuinely caught up in important work. But gradually, something began gnawing at me. You can call it intuition or a gut feeling, whatever you want. It was that nagging voice in my head whispering that things weren't quite right. I tried to dismiss it because our marriage had always been founded on trust, or so I thought. It's funny how, when you look back, you start to second-guess everything. Every missed dinner, every delayed text, every, "I'm too tired tonight, can we talk later?" began to haunt me. Eventually, she grew distant, and it wasn't just emotionally. We weren't connecting physically like we once did. The spontaneous intimacy we shared, that had vanished. Whenever I tried to get close, she had excuses that felt all too convenient. "I'm worn out from the shelter," or "I'm too stressed, I can't right now." I didn't want to be that guy, the one who jumps to conclusions about his wife just because things have gotten tough. I thought maybe it was my fault. Laurabe, I hadn't given her enough attention or had been too consumed by my own work. I reassured myself, "You're being paranoid, Dan. Relax." But then one night, something occurred that I couldn't overlook. We hadn't been intimate for a while, and then suddenly, she seemed interested. It was unexpected and a bit strange, but I wasn't about to question it. In that moment, I felt a glimmer of what we once had. But then I noticed it, a rash right in her bikini area. My mind went blank for a moment. What the hell was that? I kept quiet at first, but it nagged at me. When things cooled down, I casually suggested she should get it checked out. Just, to be safe. She looked flustered, as if I had caught her in some sort of deceit. "Yeah, I'll go see a doctor," she brushed off, but the look on her face was unsettling. Felt like she was hiding something from me. The next day, she visited the gynecologist, and when she returned, I asked how it went. Her response? A whole lot of nothing. She barely spoke, just mumbled it wasn't serious and that the doctor had given her some cream. But she wouldn't meet my gaze, wouldn't even sit down to discuss it. Instead, she quickly changed the subject, as if it were trivial. That's when the alarm bells really began to ring in my head. And here I am now, lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling and trying to piece it all together. When did things start to crumble? Was it my fault? Had I overlooked the signs? I replayed everything in my mind, searching for that moment when the shift occurred. I recalled when we were truly happy. Road trips, spontaneous stops at little diners along the highway, laughing over nothing, simply relishing each other's company. We were that couple, the ones everyone pointed to and said, "They're perfect for each other." But now all that felt distant, like a memory that didn't belong to me anymore. I wondered if I had taken it all for granted, if perhaps I hadn't been attentive enough. Laurabe, that was why she was drifting away. Laurabe, I had messed up, and this was my punishment. I could sense myself sinking into a dark space where nothing felt trustworthy anymore. Every time she was late, I found myself questioning where she actually was. Each time she left the room to answer her phone, I wanted to shout, "Who are you texting?" But I held it all inside. I didn't want to become that paranoid husband who spirals into jealousy. But deep down, I already felt like I was there. I knew something was off. I just hadn't grasped how bad it truly was yet. After that whole doctor incident with Laura, something inside me snapped. You know that feeling when you've reached your limit with the lies and half-truths, yet you still lack solid evidence? That's precisely where I found myself. The way she dismissed the gynecologist visit and evaded any discussion about it just didn't sit right with me. I felt this relentless gnawing sensation, and I couldn't simply let it go. I needed answers, so I resolved to take matters into my own hands. I knew which clinic she had visited for her appointment, so one morning, I drove there, parked across the street, and waited. Sounds insane, right? Sitting there like a stalker. But at that moment, I didn't care. I had to uncover the truth, even if it meant stepping outside my comfort zone. I lingered in the clinic's hallway like an absolute fool, watching people come and go. I'm not even sure what I was hoping to find, but when Laura's gynecologist finally emerged, I knew I had to act quickly. I approached her, my stomach churning with anxiety. I tried to maintain my composure, at least on the surface, and asked about Laura, inquiring about the rash. I attempted to frame it as genuine concern for her health, But the doctor shut me down hard. She firmly stated something about doctor-patient confidentiality, saying she couldn't share anything without Laura's consent. Her voice was polite, yet it was clear she was irritated. That irritation only fueled my suspicion. What was Laura hiding from me? Why would she evade discussing something so simple if it wasn't serious? My mind spiraled to dark places. Laurabe, she had contracted something venereal. Perhaps her volunteering at the shelter was just a cover for hooking up with someone. The thought slammed into me like a freight train. I couldn't shake it off. I was convinced this wasn't merely about her being distant or stressed at work. Something significant was happening. I felt it deep in my bones. Every late night, every excuse to stay at the shelter, every uncomfortable silence between us started to add up. I knew I had to uncover the truth no matter what. So I made the decision to follow her. I wasn't proud of it, but what other choice did I have? I started small, monitoring her routine. When she said she was heading to the shelter, I'd drive over a little later, park down the street, and watch. I know how that sounds. Trust me, I didn't like it either. But I had to see for myself. The first few times, everything appeared normal. She was there, helping people, chatting with other volunteers, and organizing supplies. She looked just like the Laura I had known for years. Still, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. It felt too perfect, too staged. The more I observed, the more I started noticing subtle details. One night, after waiting what felt like an eternity, I finally caught a break. Laura was inside the shelter, conversing with a younger staff member I hadn't seen before. They weren't engaged in anything overtly suspicious, not really. But the way they stood close together, whispering to one another, ignited something in me. I knew I couldn't ignore this any longer. The next day, I entered the shelter, trying to appear casual as if I were just stopping by to say hi. But inside, I was boiling with rage. I asked a couple of the staff members about Laura, how often she was there, what she did, and where she went after hours. Most of them echoed the same narrative. Laura was an incredible volunteer, dedicated and selfless, always going the extra mile for the homeless. However, there was one older woman who had been there for a while. She seemed uneasy when I pressed for more details. She hesitated before responding, and I could see it on her face. There was something she wasn't sharing. I pushed a bit harder, but she clammed up, insisting that Laura was a good person and that was all I needed to know. That was it. That was the confirmation I needed. The way she avoided eye contact and fidgeted spoke volumes without her saying a single word. I left the shelter that day more convinced than ever that Laura was hiding something. It wasn't just a random fling. It felt much deeper than that. I could sense it in my gut, like a lingering sickness. The doubts were consuming me. I couldn't even look at her without wondering where she'd been, who she'd been with, and what lies she was spinning to cover her tracks. I toyed with the idea of hiring a private investigator. In fact, I even researched a few online. But then I thought, no, I need to solve this on my own first. If I brought someone else into this and discovered she was indeed cheating, then what? What would I do then? I wasn't prepared for that reality. Not yet. Instead, I continued my digging. Each time she left the house, I made a point to know where she was headed. I sneaked glances at her phone when she wasn't looking. I began to notice patterns. Instances when she'd vanish for hours without explanation, or when she'd be too busy to answer my calls. I contemplated confronting her directly, demanding to know what was really going on, but I didn't want to tip her off. Not until I had solid proof. And that's when everything started to spiral out of control. The more I observed, the more I began to question everything. Every smile, every kiss, every "I love you" started to feel phony. It was as if she were merely playing a role, pretending to be the same woman I married while leading a double life behind my back. I was barely sleeping these days. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, going over every interaction we'd had in recent months, desperately searching for clues or signs of the woman I once knew. But she was gone, replaced by a stranger. Someone I couldn't trust and hardly recognized anymore. Doubt had taken over my mind, and there was no turning back. Whatever was happening with Laura, it was worse than anything I had ever imagined. And soon, I was about to learn just how dire the situation truly was. At this point, I wasn't just feeling suspicious. I was downright desperate. I couldn't just sit around and let this eat away at me. I needed answers, real answers. Watching Laura, following her, snooping through her phone, it just wasn't cutting it. I had to find out what she was hiding and who was involved. If I didn't discover the truth soon, I felt like I was going to lose my grip entirely. So I decided to take more drastic measures. I began spending more time at the shelter, keeping an eye on the people coming and going. I wanted to see if anyone there could give me the insight I was searching for. I parked my car a few blocks away and sat there for hours, blending into the background, merely observing. The shelter was always bustling with people. Most looked like they were down on their luck, worn down by life's relentless challenges. For many, this place was their last refuge before disappearing altogether. One man caught my attention, Marcus. He was a fixture at the shelter, hanging around the back, smoking cigarettes and chatting with anyone who would listen. He had an unkempt appearance. Long, greasy hair, a beard that hadn't seen a razor in ages, and clothes that looked barely functional. But there was something about him, a certain energy that suggested he knew things. Important things. One afternoon, after idling for what felt like an eternity, something snapped inside me. I got out of my car and approached him, driven by pure frustration. I didn't have a plan. I was fueled by desperation. I reached into my pocket, pulled out some cash, and waved it in front of him. "Got a minute?" I asked, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. Marcus's eyes lit up at the sight of the money, and I knew I had his attention. He nodded, mumbling something that sounded like, "Sure." Before he followed me to my car, I told him to hop in, and he didn't hesitate. My recklessness must have overridden my caution. I just needed to hear what he had to say. I kept my identity under wraps, didn't mention Laura was my wife. The less he knew, the better. Instead, I began asking vague questions, pretending to be just some curious guy interested in the shelter. "So, what's your take on Laura?" I asked, attempting to keep it casual. Marcus shrugged, a hint of a grin on his face. "She's all right, helps out a lot. Folks around here think highly of her." My heart raced, but I maintained my composure, pushing a bit further. "Yeah, she seems great. Does she, spend a lot of time here?" Marcus locked eyes with me, a sly smile spreading across his face. "You mean, do you want to sleep with her too?" The words hit me like a brick wall. I was taken aback, my mind racing to catch up. What the hell did he mean by that? I couldn't just let it slide. "What do you mean by that?" I demanded, my voice taut. Marcus chuckled. a low, unsettling sound that sent chills down my spine. Come on, man. Everybody knows. Laura's easy to get with. A couple of guys I know have already been with her. Time seemed to stand still. My wife was being passed around at a homeless shelter? The woman I thought I knew, the one I had shared my life with for years? I felt nauseous, but I forced myself to maintain a neutral expression, not allowing the fury boiling inside to surface. Are you serious? I managed to ask, my voice shaky. Marcus shrugged again, as if it was all just a casual conversation. Yeah, man. She's nice and all, but if you want something extra, it's easy to work something out. I couldn't take it anymore. I wanted to lash out, throw him out of the car, and scream my frustration. But what good would that do? I had my answer, or at least a piece of it. The confirmation I had feared was laid out before me. Laura wasn't merely cheating. She was sleeping around with these guys at the shelter. How had it come to this? I shoved some cash into Marcus's hand and told him to get out. He didn't protest. He took the money and slipped out of the car like nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just shattered my entire world with a few careless words. I sat in silence for a while after he left, staring blankly at the steering wheel, my mind racing. Every excuse Laura had ever offered, too busy, too tired, all made sense now. She wasn't worn out from volunteering. She was exhausted from sleeping with men at the shelter. The woman I had loved, the one I had committed my life to, was out there demeaning herself, engaging in activities I couldn't even begin to comprehend. The drive home was a blur. I could barely concentrate. When I walked through the door, the house felt alien, like I no longer belonged there. Every picture of us, every piece of furniture we had chosen together felt like a cruel joke. And Laura, God, I didn't even want to look at her. But when she came home later that night, I put on a mask of normalcy, keeping everything bottled up inside. I couldn't let her know that I was on to her. Not yet. But I couldn't shake off the sense of betrayal. Each time I glanced at her, I saw Marcus's smirk, heard his crude laughter echoing in my mind, his words replaying over and over. Do you want to sleep with her too? How had I let things spiral this far? How had I missed all the signs? That night, I lay next to her in bed, pretending to be asleep while she drifted off as if everything were fine. I kept staring at the ceiling, mentally replaying everything that had happened, the anger building inside me like a pressure cooker. But the worst part? The jealousy, the thought that other men had been with her, had used her, while I remained blissfully unaware. I considered confronting her right then and there. I imagined shaking her awake, demanding the truth, screaming until she confessed everything. But I held back. I didn't know if I could bear hearing it straight from her lips. So, I just lay there, feeling the weight of the revelation pressing down on me. She'd shattered our relationship, and for what? For some twisted thrill? For attention from men who didn't care about her? I couldn't fathom it, and I doubted I ever would. But one thing was clear: I could no longer pretend. Something had to change, and soon. I didn't know how I would confront her, but I was certain of one thing. Whatever happened next would alter everything. The moment I walked through the door that evening, I knew I couldn't keep pretending any longer. I had spent days simmering, replaying everything Marcus had told me over and over in my mind. The disgust, the betrayal, the humiliation. It was all consuming. Every minute spent in the same house with her felt like an insult, the anger bubbling just beneath the surface, ready to explode. Laura was in the kitchen when I got home, acting as if it were just another ordinary evening. She smiled at me, but all I could see was the facade, the mask she had been wearing for who knows how long. I stared at her, my fists clenched, the words boiling in my throat. I wouldn't let her charm her way out of this. I needed the truth, and I needed it now. We need to talk, I said, my voice tight with barely restrained fury. She looked up, confusion flickering across her face, but I could tell she sensed the shift in the air. What's wrong? She asked, feigning innocence, her voice sweet and disarming. But I wasn't buying it. I stepped into the living room, struggling to contain my anger. I know what you've been doing, I said, locking eyes with her. I know about the men at the shelter. I spoke to someone, and they told me everything. Her complexion drained of color, and for a brief moment, fear flashed in her eyes. But then, as if she had rehearsed it countless times, she feigned disbelief, shaking her head as if I were delusional. What are you talking about, Dan? That's insane. I don't know who you've been talking to, but they're lying. That's when I lost my composure. Don't play dumb with me, Laura. I talked to Marcus. He spilled everything. You've been sleeping with those guys at the shelter, haven't you? She flinched, her hands gripping the edge of the counter, as if she needed support to stay upright. Marcus? She echoed, her voice trembling. You're seriously going to believe some homeless guy over me? He's lying, Dan. He's just trying to manipulate you. My blood boiled at her defense. Don't even try that. Don't you dare twist this around. I've seen how you act, how you avoid me, dodge my questions, come up with excuses. Don't tell me I'm imagining things. I'm not an idiot, Laura. Her defenses began to crumble before me. She dropped her gaze to the floor, her voice barely above a whisper. It's not what you think. Then what the hell is it? I shouted, fury spilling over. Tell me. I want to hear it from you. Don't lie. Just say it. For a moment, she stood there, silent, like she was weighing her options, whether to maintain the facade or come clean. Then finally she broke. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and she fell apart, sobbing in front of me. I did it, she whispered. I had sex with them. Couldn't stop. I don't know why. I have some kind of problem. It's like a compulsion. I don't even understand it myself. I swear to God, Dan, I never wanted to hurt you. A compulsion? A problem? Was she for real? I stood there, staring at her, my heart racing, my fists so tight I thought my knuckles might break skin. A compulsion? I repeated, disbelief dripping from my voice. You're telling me you slept with a bunch of strangers because you couldn't control yourself? What kind of pathetic excuse is that, Laura? She was crying harder now, struggling to articulate her thoughts. It's like I can't control it. It's an illness. I know it sounds crazy, but I need help, Dan. I can't stop. Please. I'm begging you. I didn't want this to happen. I couldn't take her anymore. I couldn't even look at her. The woman I once knew was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. Someone weak, selfish, and utterly pathetic. The excuses, the tears, the justifications. It all felt like a sick joke. How could she stand there, trying to make this about her needing help? Like she was the victim in this twisted scenario? I can't believe this, I said, my voice low but simmering with rage. You destroyed us. For what? For some twisted thrill? And now you want me to pity you because you can't control yourself. She reached out, trying to grab my hand, but I pulled away. I didn't want her touching me, not after everything.
Dan, please.
I'm sorry. I know I've messed everything up, but I need you. I can't fix this on my own. But I was done. Done with the lies, done with the guilt, done with her. I'm leaving, I declared, turning my back on her. I can't stay here and listen to this anymore. Where are you going? She cried, panic lacing her voice. Please don't leave me, Dan. I'll get help, I swear. Just don't go. I didn't respond. I stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind me and leaving her to wallow in her tears and feeble excuses. I needed fresh air, space, anything to escape before I did something I might regret. I drove straight to Ethan's place. I didn't call ahead or give him a heads up. I just showed up. When he opened the door and saw my expression, he didn't ask any questions. He simply grabbed a couple of beers from the fridge and motioned for me to sit on his couch. For a while, we sat in silence. I stared at the floor, trying to wrap my mind around the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside me. Finally, Ethan broke the quiet. You want to talk about it? He asked, his voice calm and understanding. I nodded, and before I knew it, the words started pouring out. I told him everything, the nagging suspicions, the snooping, the confrontation with Marcus, and then Laura's confession. He listened intently, allowing me to vent without interruption. When I finally finished, he leaned back and sighed. "Man, that's tough," he said. "But I'm going to be straight with you. You can't save her." I looked at him, unsure of what he meant. "What do you mean?" "People like that," he continued. "The ones who get wrapped up in this kind of mess. They don't change. You can send her to therapy, try to fix things, but at the end of the day, she won't stop. That's just who she is now." I wanted to argue, to defend Laura, to insist that she could change and get the help she needed. But deep down, I knew Ethan was right. The woman I thought I had married? She was gone. The person standing in her place? I couldn't save her from herself. "You really think I should just end it?" I asked, my voice trembling. Ethan nodded with a seriousness that struck me.
Yeah, man.
"I've been where you are, and I'm telling you, this is only going to get worse if you let it. You need to walk away. Divorce her. Start fresh." The word divorce hit me like a punch to the gut. But at the same time, it felt like the only option left on the table. After that night at Ethan's, everything crystallized in my mind. The life I thought I had? It was over. The love, the trust, the partnership vanished. Laura hadn't just cheated. She had obliterated everything we had built together. As painful as it was to admit, Ethan was right. Couldn't save her. Couldn't save us. My priority now had to be saving myself. For the next couple of days, I kept my distance, avoiding Laura as much as possible. I'd leave the house early and come back late, and when I did see her, I spoke only when necessary. I could see the anxiety in her eyes. She sensed something was brewing. The guilt was palpable, as if she was waiting for the inevitable confrontation. I couldn't bear her lies any longer. It wasn't just the infidelity. Maybe I could have dealt with that if it had been a one-off mistake. But what she had done, the way she tried to manipulate me with her talk of psychological issues or compulsions, that was something entirely different. It wasn't just an affair. It was a sickness, and I refused to be dragged down into her chaos. One evening, after days of tense silence, I resolved to have the conversation. I sank into the couch, staring at the TV, waiting for her to come home. When she walked in, I could see her freeze for a moment, her expression shifting as she braced for the worst. "Dan, what's going on?" she asked, her voice laced with uncertainty. I didn't bother with niceties. I had no patience for small talk. "We need to talk." She sat down across from me, biting her lip anxiously. "What's wrong? Is this about the other night?" "Look, I know I messed up, but I'm trying, Dan. I really am. That was it. I had reached my limit. I want a divorce," I stated flatly, my voice steady and unyielding. She blinked, stunned as if she hadn't heard me correctly. "What? You heard me. I can't keep doing this. We're done." Her expression shifted from shock to panic. "Dan, no. Please don't do this. We can fix this. I know I messed up, but I'm trying to get better. I'm trying to fight this." "Fight what, Laura? Your compulsions? Your issues? Do you even hear yourself? You don't know what's wrong with you, and you expect me to stand by and wait while you figure it out." Tears sprang to her eyes, and she shook her head, reaching out toward me. But I recoiled. I didn't want her touch. I didn't want anything from her anymore.
Dan, Please.
"I love you. I can't lose you. I made mistakes, but I'm still your wife. We can work through this together. We can go to therapy, counseling, whatever it takes. Just don't give up on me." I stood up, pacing the room, my heart racing. "It's not about therapy. It's not about trying harder. It's about trust, Laura. And I don't trust you. I don't know who you are anymore. You've lied to me for months, probably longer. You've betrayed me in ways I can't even articulate. How am I supposed to move on from that?" She was sobbing now, her hands trembling as she clutched at her clothes. "I never wanted to hurt you. I didn't want any of this to happen. I just lost control." "Well, it's too late for that." I shot back, my voice firm. "You lost control, and now you've lost me. I can't do this anymore. We're done." She collapsed onto the couch, her body shaking with sobs, but I felt nothing. No pity, no sympathy. All I felt was relief. Relief that I was finally voicing the words I'd kept bottled up for so long. Relief that this nightmare was finally coming to an end. She must have realized there was no changing my mind because eventually, she stopped begging. Wiping her eyes, she sat up straight and whispered, "Okay, if that's what you want." "It is," I confirmed, my tone unwavering. "We'll need to discuss the details, splitting up the house, the finances, everything. But I'm done, Laura. This is the end." Just like that, it was over. She didn't argue or fight. She understood there was no way back from this. In the following days, we focused on the logistics, how to divide our assets, our accounts, everything we had built together. It felt cold and clinical, as if we were two strangers dissecting a life that had lost all meaning. I knew I couldn't navigate this alone. The weight of her betrayal felt suffocating, and I needed help processing the upheaval that had turned my life upside down. So I started seeing a psychologist. I had no idea what to expect, but I knew I needed someone to help me untangle the chaos in my mind. In those initial sessions, I laid everything bare, the suspicions, the lies, the confrontation with Marcus, and then the confession. The therapist listened without judgment, allowing me to release all the pent-up emotion I hadn't shared with anyone else. By the time I finished, he leaned back and let out a deep sigh. "It's a lot to carry, isn't it?" he said gently. "But you need to know this wasn't your fault. Laura's actions stem from her own demons, not anything you did or didn't do. As hard as it is to accept, you couldn't have saved your marriage. It was broken long before you realized it." That acknowledgement helped, but the memories kept creeping back in. Every time I closed my eyes, I was flooded with images of our happier days, when Laura and I were a team, full of joy and laughter. I remembered the road trips, the late-night talks, the way she used to look at me, filled with love. But then reality would hit me like a tidal wave, reminding me that those memories now felt hollow. I wrestled with reconciling the two versions of her, the woman I had loved and the one who betrayed me in unfathomable ways. But the truth was they were one and the same. I just hadn't seen it before. As the weeks passed, the remnants of my life with Laura began to fade, like a distant memory that belonged to someone else. I'd look at old photos and feel nothing. No pain, no anger, no nostalgia. Just emptiness. Those memories held no weight anymore because the person I had shared them with wasn't real, not in the way I had thought. Surprisingly, the divorce process went smoothly. Laura didn't resist much. We divided everything equitably, and just like that, the papers were signed. Felt official. We were no longer husband and wife. Walking out of that courthouse, I felt lighter, as if a burden had been lifted from my chest. Yet, there was this hollow ache in my gut. I realized I had lost something that couldn't be reclaimed, even though I knew it had slipped away long before we made it official. After the divorce, I focused on rebuilding my life. It wasn't easy, but I threw myself into therapy, determined to rise from the wreckage Laura had left behind. Each session helped me unravel the anger and betrayal I felt, and I learned to understand that her actions were not my fault. She had her own struggles, and nothing I could have done would have saved our marriage. As time passed, I began to rediscover myself. The memories of my old life with Laura started to fade, feeling like they belonged to someone else. I picked up hobbies I had abandoned, reconnected with friends, and slowly began to feel like my old self again. But one day, out of the blue, I ran into Emily, one of Laura's friends. That's when I found out Laura wasn't doing well. She had contracted HIV, refused treatment, and was spiraling into depression and alcohol abuse. Part of me felt a pang of sorrow for her, despite everything she had done. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet her. When I saw her, I barely recognized the woman I had once loved. She looked older, drained, and completely worn down by her illness and addiction. We talked, but it was clear she had given up on life. She didn't want help and didn't believe anything could change. I left feeling hollow, realizing I couldn't save her, just like I couldn't save our marriage. That encounter was the last time I saw her. Afterward, I cut contact. It wasn't my responsibility to fix her anymore. I continued working on myself and eventually met someone new, someone who rekindled my belief in love. It wasn't easy, but I started over, and for the first time in years I found peace. Looking back, I realized Laura's betrayal wasn't the end. It was part of a journey that taught me more about myself than I could have ever imagined. Her problems weren't mine to fix, and her actions, while painful, opened the door for me to start fresh. I've moved on now, and while the scars remain, they no longer define me. Every crisis is an opportunity for a new beginning, and that's exactly what I found.